We welcome to Says Who Sports right now, a Hall of Fame broadcaster, a man who has won more than 24 Emmys, the only person in television history to have won Emmys in sports, news, and entertainment, who hosted the Olympics 12 times, who's been on the call for or hosted many of the biggest sporting events in history, from the NBA Finals to the Super Bowls to the World Series, and one of the most accurate free throw shooters ever at Comac High School on Long Island, whether or not the record books reflect it. He operates with precision. Bob Costas. Bob, welcome. It's an honor.
John, thank you very much for the introduction. There's a grain of truth about the free throw shooting part, but what I always say is there's a difference between being able to shoot and being a really good player. If I was unguarded, I could shoot better than anybody at my high school, even the guys that were actually good players. The problem was that in a real game, they insisted on guarding me, and I had my own problems with guarding anyone else. But if we're just sitting there or standing there shooting free throws, and especially in rhythm with somebody rebounding for you, I was pretty accurate.
Good stuff. Excuse me, Bob. Last night, I tuned into Major League Baseball Network. I was pumped to watch Pirates-Dodgers because of, among others, Paul Skeens and Shohei Ohtani. Bob, speaking of Shohei, if he wins a third MVP, and obviously we are early in the 2024 season, got to stay healthy and all of that, obviously. But if Shohei wins a third MVP, he would be only the 11th player ever to win it 3 times. And if he does it with the Dodgers, would be only the second ever, Frank Robinson, to win an MVP in each league. Do you then put him right there with your all-time greats, especially considering the pitching factor?
Well, yeah, he's a unique player. The word unique is misused all the time. People use it when they really mean rather rare, exceedingly rare, but unique has its own meaning. And Ohtani, especially in anything close to a modern context, is unique. So he's somewhere on the short list of the greatest players who've ever played, all things considered, already. And he's still young enough to add to it for several years. And to your point, Mookie Betts also has a chance since he plays at an MVP level. He was second last year to Ronald Acuna Jr. He won an MVP in 2018 with the Red Sox, and he's still got plenty of years left as a Dodger, so he could join Frank Robinson in that exclusive club. At the moment, a club that has only one member. Frank Robinson, 61 with the Reds and 66 with the Orioles.
What are your thoughts, Bob, on Angel Hernandez? And for those that don't know, longtime Major League Baseball umpire, decades, an abrupt retirement recently, drew heavy fire for years for what many who play or cover Major League Baseball call consistently awful performance. From your perspective, Bob, was he bad? Was he beyond
that? I
have
to say this. I do not see in person or call nearly as many games as I once did. But certainly I'm aware of Angel Hernandez's reputation, and the low ratings are nearly unanimous, not just the ratings that baseball keeps, the official rankings of umpires, but from those who cover the game, broadcasters, writers, informed fans, pretty close to unanimous. The only real insight I can add to this that most people haven't heard is that his fellow umpires, and obviously there's a certain code in any profession where you don't criticize colleagues, but his fellow umpires go out of their way to tell you what a wonderful guy he is, how kind and caring and good-natured he is. And I've asked players about that, most of them retired players who I interact with at the MLB Network or whatever, but Hernandez was around for a long time, and they kind of affirmed that he was always friendly. He may have ejected them, but there was no venom in him. But that doesn't mean that he was major league caliber. And there were too many complaints over too long a period of time for it not to have some validity. And one would have to believe also, since he umpired his last game on May 9th of this year, if you were just headed toward a graceful retirement and saying, I need to spend more time with my family, either you don't start this year or you finish this year. This has all the earmarks of a settlement where baseball may have said, this has reached a breaking point, but they have some contractual obligation to him. And so they had to work out a settlement. I feel bad for him. I'm sure he loves the game,
and
I'm sure he did the best he could, but maybe he just wasn't up to the standard of most of his colleagues.
Yeah, when you said unanimous, I mean, there's a friend of yours, and actually probably several in the media, who have essentially said that there isn't a single soul that has played, this was a quote, that has played Major League Baseball while Angel was there that feels any other way but scorn. And I just thought, wow, that's coming in heavy. And was it that bad?
Well, I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but I'd be surprised if he wasn't among the leaders in reversals. And with the automated strike zone coming at some point, and we're getting closer to that, and we're getting a more refined version already of whether that was actually an accurate call of ball of strike or not. Angel doesn't fare too well in that regard either. As you can tell, I'm uncomfortable here. I don't want to pile on the guy. I don't know the guy.
Sure.
I'm sure he tried his best, and I'm sure he loves the game. And I'm even more sure that he's a nice guy because guys I respect and trust have told me that he's a nice guy. So I think, the point has been made. The idea that people are rejoicing over it or piling on, I'm not comfortable with that. Let it be.
I think that's well said. There's plenty of pile on and a lot of smiles, and I just find that strange. I appreciate you sharing your perspective. A lot of attention is being focused on the WNBA. The season is early, a few weeks in. Caitlin Clark obviously being welcomed to the league. So much, Bob, is being said about all of the peripheral, but purely from a performance perspective. Do you believe, assuming good health, that Caitlin becomes an all-star level player in the WNBA within a few years?
I think that's more. I think that's more than likely. Keep in mind that there's always an adjustment from one level of any sport to the next, and that the way the WNBA season is set up, it's right on the heels of the conclusion of the NCAA tournaments, especially if your team goes deep into it, as Caitlin's team did, getting to the final once again. So, and then she played 11 games in 20 days, the way that schedule played out, with all the attention and demands on her time. That's not an excuse. It's just a statement of what the circumstances are. She's had some good games. She's also had some games where her shooting percentage was low, and she's the focal point of defenses. And keep in mind, no matter how good a college team is, it's not comprised, whether you're talking men or women, of people, all of whom will play in the WNBA or the NBA. So now she's facing more physical play, a higher level of play, and an increased focus on her. But still, you can see in individual games or bursts within games the talent that she brings to it. Her shooting range is obvious. She's like a female Steph Curry. But her court awareness is incredible. The passes she makes, she sees the game in a way that tells you that she's had a lifelong, or at least most of her life, grasp of it. She's a unique player, or a close to unique player, and the league benefits by her presence. There's a lot in the reaction to her. We would be naive and close to blind to say that there isn't some resentment in a league that is substantially black and that has a higher percentage of non-straight players than in the general population, that there might be some resentment, not only of her fame and fortune, but of the fact that here's a young white woman who also happens to be straight, and she's getting more attention individually than the rest of the players in the league combined. But that is not her fault. And everyone in the league will benefit from that. They already have, and they will continue to. This high tide of Caitlin Clark will raise all boats. And there's nothing about her that I can see. I don't know her. I don't cover the WNBA or women's college basketball. But from what I can see, there's nothing about her that people should disrespect. You know, when Larry Bird entered the NBA, there were doubters. Those doubters were silenced not just by his transcendent ability. On anybody's list, he's one of the top 10 players of all time, but he didn't moan and whine. You know, whatever came his way, whatever was unfair that was said about him, whatever they did to test him, he just went out and played. And my perception is that that's what Caitlin Clark wants to do. Anything she's said, you know, when you get knocked around, especially off the ball, and you're obviously targeted, what Kennedy Carter did should have been called a flagrant foul in the moment, and she should have been tossed, or at least it should have been a flagrant one, and then we go from there. But, you know, so she's acknowledged that. But she's really not whining and complaining. She's trying to fulfill a role. She's signing the autographs. She's showing up for the press conferences. I think she's done everything that could reasonably be expected of her. And from a distance, I don't just admire her as a player. I think she has the right stuff as a person.
Bob, putting the business part of it, the black and white, the contractual obligations that you have aside, would you be interested in doing play-by-play on WNBA games?
Oh, I think my time for doing that is past. I dabble in a little baseball because I was with the Baseball Network from its inception in 2009. But I only do a handful of games. I think my best role now, wherever I might show up, is from an historical perspective or as an interviewer, where we tap into the fact that I've been around a long time. And I have firsthand knowledge of some things that my younger colleagues, no matter how good they are, weren't there for. So when the 50th anniversary of Hank Aaron passing Babe Ruth's record happens in April of this year, I think it's a natural fit for the Major League Baseball Network to ask me to write and narrate an essay about that moment from my perspective. And when that terrible period of time happened during COVID, when in the space of less than a year, 10 Hall of Famers died, I knew all of them. And so naturally, on a Zoom like this, because we were all cooped up, it was COVID, but I was able to comment about all of that from a perspective that a younger person, no matter how intelligent or no matter how talented, would not be able to. And I think that's generally my best role now. And I'm not pushing the envelope in any other direction.
Speaking of those that passed, Joe Morgan, a dear friend of yours, you had many games and seasons in the booth with Joe. He introduced you when you received the Ford Frick Award from the Baseball Hall of Fame. Share with me what that meant to you to have Joe, because Cooperstown is not an easy place to reach, and he was not well at the time.
No. Joe was someone I admired greatly. He was one of my favorite players even before I met him. You know, I was a guy who, even before modern analytics came in, I was reading Bill James' baseball abstract, which he was at that time mimeographing out of his home in Lawrence, Kansas. And I was on his subscriber list. And I actually thought, long before OPS became an official stat, I thought, why do we concentrate so much on strikeouts as a negative as opposed to walks as a positive? Walks isn't just because the pitcher is wild. If it was just that, then walks would be randomly distributed around baseball. Some sluggers get walks because of fear. Other guys get walks because of their batting eye or their stance, like Rickey Henderson or Joe Morgan. Joe Morgan, during his peak, combined Gold Glove defense, the ability to steal 50 to 60 bases, an on-base percentage that was through the roof because he was also hitting over 300. And for a little guy, he'd pop 25 homers for you, too. There was a period of time where all around, even on a team that had Pete Rose and Johnny Bench and Tony Perez and for a while George Foster, even not only was he the best player on that team, and Johnny Bench would tell you the same thing, he was the best player in baseball for a period of time. And he was obviously one of the most intelligent players in baseball. His baseball IQ was through the roof. So when I had a chance to work with him, I knew I was working with an astute observer of the game. Then we became good friends. I'm still in touch with his widow, Teresa. It touched me deeply when Joe passed away. And when Teresa asked me, and also the guy you referenced earlier, Marty Brenneman and Johnny Bench and some others, to speak in Cincinnati at a memorial service for him. John Miller was another, because John worked with him on Sunday Night Baseball on ESPN for many years. You could tell that this wasn't like some pro forma thing where people show up just because they've been asked and it's a duty. We all felt great respect and regard for Joe Morgan. I worked with him sometimes alone. At the beginning, it was me, Joe, and Bob Uecker. And that was a great dynamic because Uecker had a different perspective. Joe came from another place. Joe was a little more serious. Bob was obviously very funny. And then the last 3 years or so that we did baseball together before NBC lost the contract after the 2000 season, then it was just me and Joe. But by then, we had 3 seasons under our belt with Uecker, so it was easy to just transition to the two of us. I think our broadcasts were very good, and our friendship was very meaningful.
Bob, speaking of Uecker, and obviously your closeness over many years, what do you say about him as a person? We on the periphery understand, or if you tune in, you know that sense of humor is largely unrivaled. Talk about Bob Uecker, the man, Bob.
Here's something about Uecker. In addition to being so obviously funny, not just on a baseball broadcast, but, think of the Major League movies where he ad-libbed a lot of his stuff. He wrote his own stuff or ad-libbed it, and they just let him go.
Right.
And his dozens and dozens of appearances with Johnny Carson, he just had a tremendous comedic sense. But another thing about him is, and he doesn't like to talk about it, he doesn't usually wear his heart on his sleeve in this regard. He is a really loyal friend. And he observes a code that, hey, this is the baseball code. So, what we say in the clubhouse, what we say when we're not on the air, what we say amongst friends, it stays that way. And those who have broken that code with regard to him, not that any of it is scandalous or anything like that, but right. There's stuff that's public and there's stuff that's private. It's an old school code, and Bob observes that. And even at age 90, that old expression, who do you want to be in a foxhole with? If you got to walk down a dark alley or be in a foxhole with somebody who wouldn't turn and run, who would have your back because he's your friend, Uecker's one of those guys.
That is great. Thanks for sharing. You mentioned your experience, certainly, and your history in the big events. It's NBA Finals time. Mm-hmm. You were front and center for that for so many years with NBC. It sounds like there is an imminent big NBA TV rights deal. No matter the speculation or the lamenting, Bob, about how the rights fees continue to reach massive levels, and not just NBA, NFL, obviously, across the board, there's no dearth of networks that ultimately step up to buy. Somebody's going to buy. David Hill said, formerly a head of Fox Sports, said entertainment is a swamp and sports is the only firm ground. What do you think? What are your thoughts about that?
He was right. And now, when he said it, he was right. It's even more true now because the shifting media landscape leaves everybody wondering, where do we go next? But the one thing that continually aggregates sizable audiences is big-time sports events, especially football. Football reigns above all of it. The NFL is not my favorite. Baseball and basketball, the NBA and MLB are my favorites, but I recognize the popularity and importance of the NFL from an entertainment standpoint, and it's only become more true because when you look at the ratings, as best we can measure them now, and streaming makes it more difficult and to get a firm handle on it, but when you look at the ratings of what now qualify as hit television shows, they only have a fraction of the ratings that shows like Seinfeld and Friends and ER and Cheers and Cosby and all the rest had back in the 90s, let alone shows that preceded them in the 70s and 80s. You know, All in the Family, Mary Tyler Moore, whatever it might be. I'm citing comedies, but the same would be true of dramas like MASH, for example. So
Right.
I think that networks feel like we got to bite the bullet and pay the rights fee, because this is the one thing, football the most, but the others as well, the one thing where we get a guaranteed base audience and where we also reach multiple demographics, and especially the so-called much coveted young male demographic, 20 to 50 or whatever that might be. So look, the market speaks. When baseball players and other athletes were first beginning to receive eye-popping salaries, the right answer was, as long as someone's willing to pay it, the market will tell you what they're worth. Are there miscalculations? Sure, we see miscalculations all the time. Guys get hurt, they underperform. But basically, the market tells you that if player A is paid whatever and pans out as the buyer expected, it was worth it.
I absolutely agree. In fact, when I hear discussion or I hear somebody with emotion expressing that they can't understand what's wrong with this or that team, how could they possibly pay X, Y, or Z player X amount of money per year over several years? I just say, as you did, what's the deal? It's the market. That's it, right? If there's the perceived value, somebody's going to pay it. Thus, somebody's worth it.
At least in theory. There are times when teams roll the dice and it doesn't quite pan out. And movie producers and studios read scripts, cast movies, and sometimes they exceed box office expectations and sometimes they fall short. But it's all part of the business to make those judgments.
Speaking of the NBA Finals, you were in Chicago to call the 92 Bulls Blazers Finals for NBC at the old Chicago Stadium. One of your producers spotted a notable figure, someone you knew a little bit, sitting behind the basket and urged you to go down and see if that person would agree to go on air. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I like the way you phrased that, John, so we haven't given away the identity yet. That person was Jack Nicholson. And I knew him a little bit because he was a regular at Laker games. And so I'd see him and say hello to him. And I think I was at dinner with him one time prior to that with some mutual friends. And so there's 5 minutes or so to go in the second quarter. And one of the producers at NBC says to me, "Do you know Jack Nicholson?" And I say, "Well, yeah, kind of." Well, he's down there along the baseline behind the basket. He was in Chicago shooting Hoffa at that time. And of course, he's a big basketball fan. And of course, he's Jack Nicholson, so he can get good seats. They didn't happen to be center court. They were along the baseline under one of the baskets. But I knew Jack well enough, and I knew about him well enough to know that there's no way that he's going to come on with us at halftime. He wouldn't even go on with Johnny Carson just a month or so before that, during that period of time when Johnny Carson was saying farewell and everybody was lining up, climbing over one another to be on one more time with Johnny Carson. Jack Nicholson never saw him at any talk shows. And his theory always was, and I heard him state it, "I'm a movie star." People leave their homes. This is before the new realities of Netflix and everything else. People leave their homes, they go to a theater, they see me on a big screen. That's different than being on that tiny screen. So the only time I'm on that tiny screen is if they take a shot of me while I'm at the Laker game. So I know all this, and I know he's going to say no. It's also the old Chicago Stadium before they built the United Center. So you're way the hell up in the rafters. That was our perch for the pregame and halftime. And so I'd have to climb down and go around the ramp and the whole thing, because they're not just going to send word. They think I'm their emissary. I'm the guy who has to ask him. Oh, my gosh, I know this is a fool's errand. But I do it, and I finally get there. And during a timeout with about 2 minutes to go, whatever it was, I tap him on the shoulder. He's standing up. I come up behind him, I tap him on the shoulder, and I've told it this way before. He turns this way, looking over his right shoulder, and the expression on his face reminded me of his look when you first see him in The Shining. And then he realizes it's me, and at least he recognized me, and he goes, "Oh, hi, Bob." And I say, "Jack, just play along. They're watching. I'm supposed to ask you if you'll come on with us at halftime." And he says, Bobby, you're a nice kid. You do good work. How can I put this nicely? No effing way." But he didn't say effing. And I say, "Jack, I got it. Enjoy the rest of the game." Now I go racing back upstairs, barely get there before they're going to throw it to me. Marv's going to throw it to me for halftime. I know it's a total waste of time, except in one respect. 30 years later, 32 years later, I still have a story.
Oh, that's so good. So good. Back to that intro and referencing your free throw shooting. You tried out for the basketball team at Comac High School in Long Island. You didn't make the team, but you made a lot of free throws. Hit 91 of 100 during tryouts.
I think I was in the 80s during tryouts, and then there was another period of time with somebody rebounding for me in that same time frame where I made 91 out of 100. But I mean, I was at that time, the over-under on me, if I was going to shoot 100 free throws, the over-under would be around 80. And, that's where the line would break on either side. I was pretty good just shooting the ball. If we were playing horse, as a matter of fact, only a few years later, when I was the voice of the Spirits of St. Louis, until the players got wise, not the guards, but the forwards and the centers, I snookered them at practice by asking them to, engage in a three-point shooting contest. And those guys didn't shoot three-pointers. The guards did. Steve Jones did. Freddie Lewis did. But those guys didn't shoot three-pointers. But they looked at me at 5'7", and they said, "Oh, this is an easy mark." And a couple of times I beat them. And then they stopped gambling with me.
What did the coach say to you when he cut you, Bob?
I'm paraphrasing here, but something to the effect of, "I could keep you around for comic relief," because I was kind of funny. "I could keep you around for comic relief, or if there was a rule that allowed me to insert you in the game to shoot free throws, I would do that. But since there is no such rule, I have to cut you."
That's great. You tried out for the baseball team at Comac too, right? What happened with that tryout?
I did. I was just hoping to be the backup second baseman. We had a guy on our team, Don DeMola, who pitched in the major leagues. He was drafted by the Yankees, never played for them, but pitched a couple of years for the Montreal Expos, and actually had a good year sort of as a middle reliever, and then sustained an injury at some point around 1977 or something that ended his career. He could really throw hard. So we had some decent players, and I was just trying to be the backup second baseman, and I was a good fielder, and I knew the game. I was alert. So I was the kind of guy who'd take the extra base, that kind of thing. But as Chuck Orant, who was a math teacher and also the baseball coach, and had played professional baseball back when the minor leagues went all the way down to D-ball, he pitched in the Pirates organization in the early 1950s and got as far as D-ball, maybe C-ball. So he had that credibility of having played professional baseball. And he said, "Costas, there's no doubt you're good with the glove, and there's no doubt you know the game, but I don't think you can hit your weight, and I don't think you weigh 130, which might have been true in 1968 or 69. And so that was the way he cut me. He also suggested that I consider broadcasting. And I told him I've been considering that for a long time. And he said something to the effect of, "Good, you got a better shot at
that." Great stuff. The Stanley Cup finals are starting too. Are the NHL playoffs, Bob, the toughest postseason in professional sports? And I say that, or ask that, in terms of what a team has to accomplish to win the cup. There are no buys.
Right.
and you got to win 16, right, to win the cup?
Yeah. I don't know because other than the minor league hockey I called at the beginning of my career, and the few times I filled in for the great Dan Kelly, who was the Doc Emmerich of his time, the voice of the St. Louis Blues, when I was at KMOX, and I filled in on a few games when he had network assignments, and then hosting the Winter Classic a few times on NBC. That's the extent of my close involvement with hockey. Of course, I follow it as a fan, so I can't say with credibility that it's the hardest road to the championship, but you make a good point about that. No buys. There's no buys in the NBA either, but unless you consider the play-in round, and that happens quickly. So the one draws the eight once the eight has been established. But I get your point. But I will say for sure that playoff hockey is uniquely dramatic and tense, especially when a game goes to overtime with so much at stake. You know, it can end so abruptly. Whereas, let's say the seventh game of the World Series goes to extra innings, and that's pretty tense. But there's 3 outs, and if you're the home team, even if they score 3 runs, you got last licks coming up. The clock is ticking down in basketball and football in a way that's just different in hockey. You know, possession doesn't mean the same thing in hockey. It changes so quickly. And it has its own kind of drama. And part of hockey's lore are the marathon games that have gone into a second and even a third overtime that people still talk about. That's among the most edge of your seat type experiences you can have in sports.
Great stuff. Yeah, intense. So intense. Each game, first round, right through the Cup Finals. Just, I find it so compelling. Speaking of the hockey, long way from NHL, long way from the Stanley Cup Finals. But during your senior year, at Syracuse University in 1974, you were the play-by-play broadcaster for the minor league hockey Syracuse Blazers. Yes. What was that experience like, Bob?
You know, I've said this before. I knew how crazy the Eastern Hockey League was while it was happening. I knew how crazy and colorful the ABA and especially the Spirits of St. Louis were while it was happening. But it's only in retrospect, nearly a half century later, it is a half century later when you talk about the Blazers, it's only as years went by that I fully grasped that the first 2 professional broadcasting experiences of my life were crazier than anything that would follow. And I was witness to a lot of crazy things in the 4 or 5 decades subsequent. But the Eastern Hockey League and the ABA are at the top of the craziness pyramid, at least in my experience. And the Eastern Hockey League is the actual league that the Paul Newman movie, the classic Slapshot, is based on. And I knew some of the guys who were extras in the movie. The Johnstown Jets had a player named Galen Head. His sister, no, I'm wrong. They did have a player named Galen Head. Yes, they did. But they had a player named Ned Dowd. And his sister, Nancy Dowd, wrote the screenplay for Slapshot. The character, Ogie Oglethorpe, is based on Bill Goldthorpe, who played for the Syracuse Blazers and was the most feared enforcer maybe in the history of hockey, certainly on that list, and certainly he was at the top when it came to the Eastern Hockey League. And there were so many unbelievable episodes. You had to see it to believe it, and I did see it, so I do believe it. But they're unbelievable when you recount them to other people years later. It was just one season, but it's a season I'll never forget. I recognized a lot of the players from the Eastern Hockey League, especially the Johnstown Jets, who were extras in the movie. I went back to Johnstown a few months ago in late January, early February of this year. Wasn't exactly the 50th anniversary of my first professional broadcast. That was in October of 1973, but it was as close, given my schedule, as I could come. And I took my son with me. We flew into Pittsburgh, rented a car, we drove to Johnstown. They had back-to-back games in the same arena, the Cambria County War Memorial, that the Jets had played in 50 years before. And we took in a couple of games. I dropped the puck at one of the games, walked around town, and gave my son the feel. He's a producer now at the Major League Baseball Network. But from the time that he was 6, 7 years old, he was traveling with me to the NBA Finals and to the World Series and seeing those events from that perspective. And I wanted him to see what it was like in the low minors, what the arena was like, what passed for the broadcast booth, what that was like, but also how friendly and warm the people in a small town where the team is kind of a focal point of the community, how that differs. And some of the people that I encountered there a few months ago had been there 50 years ago. An usher who's now 80 might have been an usher there then. And some of them remembered me. It was a heartwarming experience, and it filled in a little blank in my son's understanding of his father's career.
Great stuff. Thanks for sharing, Bob. What Keith didn't see and what happened far from the ice during that season you spent with the Blazers, speaking of Goldie Goldthorpe, you had we'll say a potentially dangerous situation on the team bus one night. Tell me about that.
Well, Goldie was a simple man. His concerns were playing hockey, beating people up, mostly on the ice, but occasionally at bars or backroom alleys if people foolishly challenged him, and the passing affections of young women who were attracted to the hockey scene. That was basically the hat trick of his concerns. And he had, therefore, at least at first glance, little use for me. And so he was kind of contemptuous of me. You know, what is this little guy doing here? Blah, blah. And one day on the bus, I guess it would make a better story to say we were on our way to Johnstown, but I think we were on our way to Long Island to take on the Long Island Ducks, a legendary minor league franchise of their own that had John Brophy, who later coached in the NHL. And for a long time, he was the most penalized man in the history of hockey at any level. But the league was filled with colorful characters. I mean, there was a riot at a game in Johnstown. Police had to show up to disperse the crowd. There were fights where not only were the players fighting, but the bus driver comes out on the ice to fight. The coaches fight one another. You know, they're sloshing around in street shoes, and they're ripping one another's sport coats. The trainer, not to be left out, comes out. I mean, it's insane. I'm thinking to myself, am I supposed to go next door to the next broadcast booth and start duking it out with Eli Gold, the longtime voice of the Alabama Crimson Tide, by the way, but then he was the voice of the Long Island Ducks. I've been his friend for 50 years. This is just insane. Okay, so we're on the bus, and I'm minding my own business, reading the New York Times. The very fact that I was reading any newspaper, but perhaps especially the New York Times, enraged Goldthorpe. So he reaches over my shoulder, he rips the paper away from me, stands up, and tears it into shreds in the aisle of the bus and lets it fall like New Year's Eve confetti. And now everybody's looking at this scene, trying to sum up what's going on. And I, like an idiot, I'm 21 years old, I figure I can't let this thing pass without something in response. And I say, hey, don't be jealous, Goldie. I'll teach you to read. That did not calm the situation. So he yanks me out of my seat and he slams me up against the wall of the moving bus. And he reaches up into the overhead rack and he pulls down a hacksaw. And somebody said, what was a hacksaw doing there? Well, you know, we didn't exactly have a full staff. You had a head coach and a trainer and a bus driver. So the players would trim their
resources were minimal
with the hacksaws. They do it themselves. All right. So he's got the hacksaw. Now he puts the hacksaw up under my chin. All right. And he's spitting out some expletives. And I know that he's only trying to scare me. And he had succeeded in that. I know he has no intention of really doing me any harm. I also know that he's not the sort of person that would take into account all the dynamics of this situation. What if the bus swerves to avoid a deer on the New York Thruway or hits a pothole or whatever the hell happens? Maybe something unintended then occurs. But after, a few moments, seemed like an eternity at the time, he relinquishes his grasp, lets me go, Some of the veteran players had come from the front of the bus. You know, there's a pecking order. The coach and the veterans sit up front. Younger guys sit in the back. They were making their way towards us, going, Goldie, Goldie, put Bob down, trying to calm the situation. So anyway, eventually he did. He sat back down. I sat back down. And really, after that, John, we got along just fine. You know, I think it's a certain code. Obviously, I wouldn't have fared well if it came to blows. But in a way, I stood up for myself. And I think he understood that and respected it. And we got along pretty well after that. And now fast forward more than 40 years, and there was a memoir written. He had some help with it, I'm sure, but a memoir written about his life in hockey. And I wound up writing the foreword. He asked me to write the foreword, and I did. So everything comes full circle.
That's great stuff. What a classic story, Bob. Excuse me. You've had a lot of big moments in big games at the microphone, and you got to have that call that does the moment justice, and these days certainly satisfies the media and the social media bloodhounds. At the 95 World Series, you had a great line you've said that came to mind just a few seconds too late. Tell me about that.
Some broadcasters, and I'm not criticizing them for it, there are some broadcasters who have a line in their hip pocket or a summation if the event plays out in a way that might be anticipated or hoped for. And if it works, it works. I've never done that. I have storylines in mind because you should be aware of the storyline. I knew it in 1998, for example, that it was likely, as Phil Jackson had dubbed it then, it became more famous because it's the name of the documentary, but Phil Jackson said this may be the last dance. We knew that that could be the end of the glorious run of the Bulls, and it might be the end of either Michael Jordan's NBA career or his time with the Chicago Bulls. So we knew that that was the storyline. But I didn't feel like you could script anything because what if Utah had won Game 6? Then there's a Game 7 a few nights later in Salt Lake City. So when Michael Jordan made that famous last shot, there's still 5 seconds to go. And I said something along the lines of, who knows what will unfold in the next several months, but that may be the last shot Michael Jordan will ever take in the NBA. And then luckily for me, the great production people just matched it perfectly. And when I said, if that's the final chapter, what a way to close the book. If that's the last image of Michael Jordan, how magnificent is it? They had perfect pictures matched to it in real time. So was I aware of what the storyline was? Of course I was, but I didn't script it. So now to your point about the 95 World Series, the Braves had been knocking on the door. They'd gone to the World Series in 91 and 92 and lost it. They'd gone to the LCS in 93. They likely would have been in the playoffs if the strike hadn't blown out the end of the season in 94. And now here they are back again in 95. We don't know that they would win many more division titles after that and go to the World Series a couple more times after that. But this would be the only championship in that run of 14 straight division titles. This would be the only championship. But by the mid-90s, it had begun to feel like the Braves are knocking on the door. And is this the time that the door will finally open for them? So they're ahead 1-0. They're up 3-2. They're ahead 1-0 in the ninth inning in Atlanta. It's important that they're at home. And Mark Wohlers is closing it out. Tom Glavine pitched the game of his life, a one-hitter through 8. Wohlers closes it out. Carlos Baerga is the last hitter for Cleveland. Hits a line drive in a left center field. Marquise Grissom runs it down, makes the catch. And I just said something like, the team of the 90s has its world championship, which at the time was a good call and true. They had been the team of the 90s to that point. Who knew that starting the next year, Joe Torre, Derek Jeter, and the Yankees would go off on a run of their own? But the Braves still had a chance to make that true had they won the 99 World Series against the Yankees, because then they would have split 2 World Series with the Yanks. They each would have had 2 world championships in the 90s, and the Braves would have had a better overall record and more division championships. So that statement, which now seems a little off for the rearview mirror, actually was pretty accurate in 1995. But to your point, And eventually I'm getting around to it after this long preamble.
No, I love it.
To your point,
amazing detail, Bob.
Here's what happened. Because I didn't script anything. If I had, in this one instance, it would have served me well. Grissom makes the catch, and because it's Atlanta, the place goes nuts. And of course, it's television, so you shut up and just let the scene play out and all the noise and the tumult. And not more than 5-10 seconds after Grissom had that ball in his glove, this popped into my head. Atlanta at last. That has everything you want from a caption. It resonates and it's concise. And somebody said to me once after hearing me tell this story, that would have been on T-shirts forever in Atlanta. And that guy was right. There would have been T-shirts saying Atlanta at last within days of that. That's the one time I wished I had scripted it out.
Wow. But you thought of it. Nobody can take that from you.
I thought of it too late.
Fragment.
Thought of it too late.
Yeah. But that's great stuff. You called a baseball game of the week in 1984 that became known as the Sandberg Game. Cubs-Cardinals at Wrigley Field. Sandberg hits game-tying home runs in the 9th and 10th innings off Cards closer and former Cub, Bruce Sutter. Cubs go on to win the game in 11. There was one notable big-time Cubs fan who wasn't able to be at Wrigley that day. And months later, in the cold of winter, that Cubs fan shows up at your house for reasons related to that game. Please share.
That is right. Boy, you did some good research here. Yeah, it's the winter of 84 into 85. And I was living in New York then, had an apartment at 57th and 1st. And the doorbell rings. This is like, I didn't have a cell phone then, so and people just showed up then, so the doorbell rings.
Yes.
It's like a Saturday afternoon. And I open the door and it's Ahmad Rashad, who I'd been working with on the football show. Great guy, longtime friend. By now he's a longtime friend. We were new friends then. And he's standing with a guy who at first, my first glance, I think, this is a homeless guy. What is he bringing this homeless guy in? He's got all disheveled. He's wearing a wool cap. And then I look a little closer, and it's Bill Murray. And Ahmad and Bill were friends for a while. And Bill, as everyone knows, is a Chicagoan, huge Cub fan, had famous appearances from time to time with Harry Carey in the booth at Wrigley Field, named a kid, this goes back more than 40 years, but named a kid Homer Banks Murray. Kid's first name is Homer, middle name is Banks, okay? And so there's Bill Murray with Ahmad, and Bill says, I hear you have a tape of the Sandberg game. And back then, that didn't mean a link on a phone or an iPad. It was a long game. It meant like 4 VHS tapes. But I had it. I had a VHS machine. We ordered pizza. We sat there, and we watched it. Because Bill was in Europe shooting a film called The Razor's Edge. And he missed the game. And he missed that chunk of a great season. He was back in time for the playoffs, but he missed that part of the summer, and he hadn't seen the Sandberg game. So we sat and watched the game together. So that started a friendship. Ahmad and I were already friends, and Bill and I have crossed paths many times since then. And it just shows you, how sports gets into our hearts and our imaginations and how it makes connections. And as a matter of fact, in a couple of weeks, June 23rd will be the 40th anniversary of the Sandberg game. And they are unveiling a statue at Wrigley Field, a statue of Ryne Sandberg, appropriately on that anniversary. And Ryne has asked me to come to Chicago and introduce him at the ceremony before the game.
Wow, talk about a grand slam right there. That's powerful stuff. Thanks for sharing. And just a couple of more, Bob. So thankful to you for taking the time. Sports media is so fragmented now, so different, obviously, from when you came up. On one hand, seemingly more opportunities for a young broadcaster, and on the other, a lot of bad ones. What do you say, Bob, to the young broadcaster out there looking to make his or her way up about trying to stay true to what feels right, what they think they love, while sifting through piles of garbage?
Yeah, and I know you've made these points yourself. I think there should be some lasting and timeless virtues that are respected and people adhere to. The credibility of it matters. If you're going to be critical, make sure it's fair. There's a difference between irreverence and snark. And it doesn't, just because somebody said it someplace online, doesn't mean it's A, true, or B, insightful. What should still matter, it doesn't matter whether I prefer to hold a newspaper in my hand with a cup of coffee because that's the way I grew up, and someone else is reading it on their phone. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if something came off Gutenberg's printing press hundreds of years ago. What matters is, was it true, was it fair, and was it well written? That matters, okay? And the same thing should apply today. But I think that a lot of that has been lost. When it comes to the debate shows on television, even if some of the people are well informed, it's a ridiculous idea that a bunch of adults will be in a state of high dudgeon about a dozen different topics a day. Not just opining, but like getting all worked up about a dozen different topics. And nuance is generally kind of, not always, but generally nuance is pushed aside there because you have to have a hot and emphatic take. And collectively, for a variety of reasons, the general population's attention span has been reduced. So if people speak in paragraphs rather than in bumper sticker statements, that exhausts the attention span of some people, which again works against nuance, works against texture, works against painting a nuanced and more accurate picture of a given situation. I don't have anything against the new technology. I use it myself. But as I said, I think what I would tell any aspiring broadcaster, the basic precepts of journalism and good broadcasting that I respected and admired as a young guy and tried to emulate and do in my own way, those should still be the guideposts.
Bumper sticker take. What a great way to put it.
But
and
by the
Bob
way,
Costas,
our politics is bumper sticker politics in large part.
Ooh, you got that right. We'll have you back for part 2,
Yeah.
3, 4, 5, and won't even begin to touch that. Bob, lastly, you have lived a hell of a life. From a professional perspective, you've been to the moon, perhaps multiple times. Share your thoughts about what this ride has been like for you and what it means to you.
Well, I'm very appreciative and grateful for the good fortune that has placed me at the scene of so many memorable events, and also has allowed me to share those events with my family and with my friends. I've mentioned this only occasionally when people have asked about it, and I never mentioned it publicly until I was asked in a situation like this a few years ago. But in the 90s and then again in the 2000s, I was offered prestigious opportunities to leave sports. But especially in the 90s, a primary reason why I didn't is that it's hard to say to a little kid, hey, I'm interviewing the Secretary of State on 60 Minutes. You want to come? But it rings the bell for a little kid, and I had a son and a daughter in the 90s. They're in their 30s now, but they were little kids. You take them to the NBA Finals, take them to the World Series, take them to the Olympics. That's an important shared experience, and it's a blessing of sports and the way sports cuts across so many different lines. I was always surprised through the years, the people, including many accomplished people, who recognized me before I was introduced to them. because sports is not because of anything so special that I did, but because sports, I'm sure Jim Nance could tell you the same story, or Al Michaels, or Mike Tirico now, or Joe Buck. Um, it just cuts across in a way that very few things still do in a niche world. So all those experiences, and then being able to do what you hope to do. I mean, I hoped, if you had said to me when I was 21 years old, someday you'll be the radio voice of a major league team, and in the off season, maybe you'll call basketball games on the radio, I'd say I'd take that deal right now. I had no way of anticipating all the things that happened, including things outside sports. And the vast majority of them worked out extremely well. So, it's gratifying to have a dream and have so much of it come true.
Wow. It's the one and only Bob Costas. Bob, thank you again for taking the time. And most importantly, thank you for everything you've done for sports. In an old school word, journalism. And Bob is at the top of that list. Thank you so much again, Bob, for everything you've done.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it very much.